money for Ukraine. And that's not to say there aren't people like Chuck Schumer proposing we send $100 billion to Ukraine and make it election-proof. But it's clear that NATO is not winning this one in the way that Biden had promised or even believed we could. So now everyone's attention is on a gut-wrenching another crisis. And I also have to say I'm somewhat stunned by the arrogance of these people who think that they can control everything, like our spokesperson for the National Security Council, Admiral Kirby, who actually said in public how well the defense industry has been doing since the Ukraine war began. I mean, you would think they'd keep it to themselves rather than blurt it out, so we can send more weapons, I guess, somewhere else. Now, I'm just going to jump to one other aspect of what LaRouche said and then show a couple visuals and introduce my guests. He said, but then look at it from the standpoint of economics. What is important about this area, which is called today the Middle East? Why is it such a cockpit of conflict? Why has it been such a cockpit of conflict since way before anybody knew of a Jew in the Middle East? In the ancient wars among Egypt, among the Hittites, among the people of Mesopotamia, and similar kinds of wars, the wars of the 7th century BC, which involved essentially the Greeks allied with the Egyptians against Phoenicia, and the expansion of Phoenicia in the Western Mediterranean being combated and controlled by another civilization there. So the conflict is ancient. And in this situation, something happens. You have a culture whose leading characteristic in this known period was that of a maritime culture, not an inland culture. There were inland cultures, but they were not progressive. So what is the meaning of this area? It's an area between the Mediterranean, which becomes a center of growing culture, and the Indian Ocean and Asia in general. So he goes on, and I just want to show you some maps because I think we really do have to think of this differently, and we have to think of the world. The world has become very much smaller over the last generations due to largely transportation and communication. We've heard the reports of astronauts who, the first time they ever get into Earth orbit, or certainly far away, the orbit of the moon, looking back on Earth, have the distinct shock about how small the Earth is in relation to space, and wonder why it is that we inhabitants of this planet cannot find it within ourselves to figure out how to get along, since it's a very small place in the universe and we have much to do. So I'm just going to now go to something here because I want to show you what the significance of this process known as the BRICS and BRICS Plus, something really that LaRouche's work set into motion, is. So here you have a map of the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa is missing, but there it is. It's not in green. I don't know why. That's the original BRICS group. And you can see these are rather large nations. India and China each have over 1.4 billion people or so. Just between them, that's 3 of the approximately 8 billion people on the planet. When you add Brazil, Russia, then you get a bit more. And now look at this. These are the new nations, some of them, minus Argentina, which is not on this map. But look at the configuration of the new BRICS members: Ethiopia, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. Look at their geographic location. Look at Israel, Palestine, this conflict. And up here, here's Turkey, here's Crimea up here, and Ukraine. Think about how the conflict is being deployed against the potential progress of the BRICS. And I'm going to go to a world map so you can really look at it here. So here you see, and I have to say this has been taken from visualcapitalist.com. The red are the original BRICS nations. The blue are the nations which the BRICS just invited to join. There's Argentina there. The yellow are nations which have applied for membership in the BRICS. And here you see is their global share of GDP, just the BRICS alone, 29%. And I guess they're including them with the expanded BRICS. Yeah, 46% of the world's population, 43% of the oil production, 25% of exports of goods. So I would ask you to consider our President Biden's assertion that it's really terrible that Russia and China are isolating themselves. It's actually the United States and Western Europe which have isolated ourselves by antagonizing the rest of the planet. And even as we are doing that, because we will come back to this discussion on the theme of what the forgotten men and women of America can do to save the world, even as we are busy destroying the rest of the world or making ourselves a leper, because certain nations, you can see from the progress in China and Russia, simply don't intend to be destroyed. We are destroying ourselves from within. We have shut down our productive capability. Lyndon LaRouche warned about this going back to the 1950s, the 60s, his forecast warning of Nixon decoupling from the dollar from gold, the takedown of the Bretton Woods system, the fictitious dollar, which has now no relationship whatsoever to physical production or the standard of living. And as a result, what we see is one, a massive division where you have a certain group, and it grew a lot during the pandemic, of super ultra wealthy people, and then a group of people who work very hard to get paid very little while they are being looted by this hyperinflationary blowout we're experiencing. And then you have the actual physical breakdown of our economy. And these things are all affecting every single one of us, affecting every single one of us, I should say. Then when you put on top of that collapse, which people are witnessing, the horror that we now see unfolding, and we can thank our lovely news media for being sure to show us every incendiary, inflammatory, horrific act of barbarism, perpetrated or not perpetrated, real and staged, to get everybody in the most despairing, horrific mindset, and people become paralyzed and despondent. That's what we can't afford, because the United States has a certain legacy from some of our greatest Americans. There is a reason why people like Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, Frederick Douglass, Lyndon LaRouche, Marian Anderson, Eleanor Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, why these people were Americans, which is a revolutionary quality against colonialism, against empire. And I'm convinced that we can ignite that spark, which is now buried very deep beneath a lot of gunk in the American people, and get our nation to function for the good in the world. So what we're going to hear from tonight is first Dennis Speed of the LaRouche Manhattan Project. We have a special guest with us, Darryl Nichols, who was a leader of the NAACP, was also a material and logistics officer in the U.S. Army, has worked in human resources development, formerly for Fiat Chrysler Automobiles, now Stellantis, has a real view on what's happening with the auto sector and productive sector in the heartland of the United States. And my friend Jose Vega, who is famous for his interventions, who just returned from China. And I think we're going to have a very interesting and hopefully uplifting and inspiring conversation. So we'll go first to Dennis. And let me just say, for everyone's protection, participation in a Sare for Senate symposium does not constitute endorsement of any political campaign, and all of us may not agree with each other, which is a wonderful thing. So, Dennis, why don't you please go ahead?
Okay, very good. Am I able to be heard?
Yes.
I'm good? Okay, great. Well, we had a meeting today of the International Peace Coalition. This is an organization that has been proposed by Helga LaRouche, the president of the Schiller Institute, but constitutes many different organizations, many different people from around the world. They have all sorts of views, but they have one idea, which is to set aside all of the differences that may exist among any number of people or any number of organizations in favor of focusing right now on the urgent need for peace throughout the world. At the conclusion, several things were actually proposed. In fact, Darryl proposed something which we may have a chance to discuss a bit tonight, the conception of a People's Congress. I'll let him speak to that because it was his own proposal. But I'd like to say something or quote something, actually, that I was writing for other purposes, but in reflection on the matter that is in front of us tonight. Everybody is aware of what is happening, or should be aware of what is happening, or seems to be happening in Gaza and on the Gaza-Israel border. But there's a sort of a larger conception, I think, that has to really be brought to bear. And I want to do that by referring to a few thoughts I put down and then a couple of sections from Martin Luther King. The 2 million human beings trapped in the prison that is Gaza will be sacrificed like Iphigenia by her father Agamemnon on the altar of victory in a no-win war. Or they will be saved, like Isaac was, from certain death at the hands of his father Abraham by an unseen power. Power is reason. That power is unseen in the blind rage of retribution, revenge, an eye for an eye, a rank, drunken feeling state that disqualifies reasoned judgment and would place all of humanity eyeless in Gaza at the mill with slaves. Be warned, the prison that today is Gaza is actually the prison that is Israel, the prison that is Ukraine, the prison that is NATO. It is a prison of the axioms of an imperial colonialism whose dead hand grips the brain of the living, and from which only people with the courage to change their axioms, like the assassinated Yitzhak Rabin, can deliver an otherwise doomed humanity. The International Peace Coalition declares that an eye for an eye brings blindness, not justice. That to build a new temple of hope and peace, people throughout the world require a new security and development architecture and architect. And that Samuel P. Huntington, who wrote The Clash of Civilizations, was wrong when he claimed in his book, The Soldier and the State, that we know who we are by those who we hate. We know who we are by the fact that we love and we have the strength to love. What I want to do is to refer to a section from Martin Luther King's collection of sermons called Strength to Love. And before I go to this, I just want to reference that, Martin Luther King has a statue on the Mall. And, Roosevelt is on the Mall. And of course, that's the mall that has the Lincoln Memorial. And there's, of course, the Washington Monument. So clearly, King is thought to, in some fashion, represent something that seems to relate to the fabric of the founding of the nation, or the perpetuation, at least, of the principles for which the nation is founded. But he's probably, even more than Lincoln, the most ignored of the people that are on the Mall. Ignored in all sorts of ways and by all sorts of people. His principles of creative, nonviolent, direct action virtually never are invoked in situations which require them, like the one that we're in right now. He had a sermon that he wrote called "The Death of Evil Upon the Seashore." And I want to quote from it because I think that it provides an idea for us as to how we have to act at a time where all of the institutions have failed us. Within the wide arena of everyday life, we see evil in all of its ugly dimensions. We see it expressed in tragic lust and in inordinate selfishness. We see it in high places where men are willing to sacrifice truth on the altars of their self-interest. We see it in imperialistic nations, crushing other people with the battering rams of social injustice. We see it clothed in the garments of calamitous wars that leave men and nations morally and physically bankrupt. In a sense, the history of man is the story of the struggle between good and evil. All of the great religions have recognized the tension at the very core of the universe. Hinduism, for instance, calls this tension a conflict between illusion and reality. Zoroastrianism, a conflict between the God of light and the God of darkness. And traditional Judaism and Christianity, a conflict between God and Satan. Each realizes that in the midst of the upward thrust of goodness, there is the downward pull of evil. Christianity clearly affirms that in the long struggle between good and evil, good eventually will emerge as victor. Evil is ultimately doomed by the powerful, inexorable forces of good. Good Friday must give way to the triumphant music of Easter. Caesar occupied a palace and Christ a cross, but the same Christ so split history into AD and BC that even the reign of Caesar was subsequently dated by his name. What is needed at this point, especially when we look at the implicit, apparent subject of the division going on right now in what is mistakenly called the Middle East, but which is Southwest Asia, is the so-called core religious conflict. Christianity, Islam, and Judaism all claim reason to have access to and unfortunately possession of Jerusalem. And many matters that people would wish to say are being discussed rationally are not being discussed rationally. For many people, these are religious questions, questions of faith. That does not mean that there's something wrong with faith, but it is to suggest that what people keep referring to as a political conflict in that part of the world is no such thing. And you will not get at any solution if you try to propose a political solution in that way. There are economic matters that are independent of the political solution and require being addressed, because you cannot address people who are impoverished and who are being destroyed and are being killed and are being set up to be killed. Unless you deal with those people's human needs, then you have not even respected their humanity, let alone offer to have a conversation with them about some sort of rules of law or rules of lawlessness. There's no possible way to even begin doing that in the present circumstance. And there is certainly no conclusion through war, because there has been nothing but war there. And as Diane already said, the war precedes the people who are there. The war is endemic to the area, and whether you're Jewish or you're Islamic or you're Phoenician or you're Egyptian or you come from Greece or you come from the Troy, or you come from Assyria, or you come from Babylon, or you come from Persia, or you come from Tyre, the area has been characterized by this. So in fact, it is a disease of war which precedes the people, and people simply fill in the atrocities. And then everybody does is they talk about the particular individual people and their individual atrocities. Now that's right, but it is wrong, because it misses and this is the issue that King is addressing, and I want to conclude with. What's needed is to take the concept of creative, nonviolent, direct action, with that being coupled with economic development as the name for peace. Yes, Lyndon LaRouche happened to have written an extensive policy for long-term development of this area many years ago. And yes, in his International Development Bank, he talked about how you can never have justice toward these areas unless you take the most advanced scientific and technological capabilities and allow those areas, as well as areas in Africa and Asia and South America more broadly, to enjoy the same benefits as the richest portions of the planet. But we will never get there unless we first understand that there is no other. There is no enemy in that sense. There is only ourselves. Nothing which is human is alien to any of us, and we cannot see one another as alien. What the International Peace Coalition was discussing and what Helga Sepp LaRouche said, I just want to get that one section of something she brought up in my conclusion. She said this. She said, I think that what we have been trying to do from the very beginning, when we started this discussion process of trying to put together an international peace coalition, of trying to unite all peace groups with the idea that we have to put all differences aside, that we can discuss all issues which divide us later, because the threat to world peace is so enormous. And therefore, the demand to have a new security and development architecture, which takes into account the interests of every single country on the planet, that can only be accomplished if there is development, especially economic development for all. And that is underlined, especially now with this second crisis erupting. She was referring to the crisis in Southwest Asia. So at today's meeting, as I referenced, and maybe Darryl has other things he wants to talk about, but he proposed something very interesting. He called it a People's Congress. And he was proposing it from the standpoint of positive action to be taken in this context and now to address these circumstances. And so whatever else he will talk about, I wanted to make sure that I plugged that in the event that he might have forgotten it.
Thanks, Dennis. Why don't you go ahead, Darryl?
Well, thank you, Dennis. What a setup.
Yeah.
And really, probably a setup. But thank you so much. And again, I want to thank you for having me on your program and presenting me to your listeners. On a very, very serious note, and I appreciate all of the sharing, because I happen to be a more than a practitioner and well studied in a lot of the doctrine and the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. So it's really fitting that we're talking about, what our leadership or what past wisdom has taught us and how we can leverage that to where we're at today. And I stopped to think about, even for the listeners, it's a very, very difficult conversation to have with people who really aren't in the know. I was having a conversation with Amber Smith, one of our allies here, about an hour and a half ago, about one of the challenges like we had in our meeting today, because I had some friends on, but the conversation is so steep, it gets to the deep end so quickly, that if somebody, it's the equivalent of talking to somebody in the third grade, but now the world we need to be talking about at the collegiate level, if not grad school, because humanity is really in a balance. And I'm not saying that to exaggerate. When you stop to think that it was just in February this year that it was the Board of Atomic Scientists, the maintainers of the doomsday clock, when they came up with their annual assessment. And for those that don't know, they've been doing this since 1947, after we started playing with atomic weapons. But now we are at the closest, by their assessment, January, February, humanity was 90 seconds away from midnight. And as a humanity, we have never been so close to a point where either economic or if it's environmental, take whatever it is. At that point, before the war in Ukraine broke out, we were already, by our best minds that are on this board, Nobel laureates, Peace Prize winners. And so we can't dismiss that. And I would encourage people, that that are really kind of Pollyanna about the situation we're in to really give that some serious thought. That now we are at a point where when it hits midnight, it's like game over. And now the war in Ukraine broke out. We've got economic issues around the world. Financial bubbles are popping. And now we've got situation developing in between Israel and, well, in the East. So what I want to say is we can't overemphasize enough. I can't overemphasize enough what Dr. King had called even back in the 60s, with the fierce urgency of now. And he would go on to say that even our democracy does not afford us the luxury of having an anemic democracy. And we've been anemic to some degree. And to some extent, we're a lot like, I think, who was it, Rip Van Winkle. An interesting thing, because Dr. King once gave a sermon, and it was calling about remaining awake through great revolution. And as an analogy, he talked about that great book of Rip Van Winkle and how he went up to the mountain. And on his way up to the mountain, there was a picture of the King of England on a big poster. And he went up there and took a little nap underneath a tree. And he ended up falling asleep for 20 years. But in the story, in the one passage of that book, you know, the next paragraph, it goes on to describe how he comes down the mountain and he sees an unfamiliar face. And that face on that billboard was George Washington. And in that one paragraph, it just tells us really what happened. And King went on to tell us that Brother Rip slept through an entire revolution. And to some extent, that is what's going on with us right now, to humanity at large, to people at large. That the powers that be, all of the distractions that we have got us to the point of these divisions that we have created or we have allowed to come among us. But we are sleeping through a great revolution. And if nothing else, my message is, you know, tell everybody, you know, wake Brother Rip up. Because we are in the midst of a revolution and we can't sleep through this one, because even by the Board of Atomic Scientists, you know, we are approaching midnight. Or if I had to quote another king, I would say, you know, he's got a book and a sermon called Knock at Midnight. You know, several years ago, I had a chance to talk to Coretta Scott King and Bernice King. We were in Atlanta at a diversity conference. And I would go there every year. And during that 3 or 4 days, I would take one night where I would leave the comfort of my hotel room and I would go to the reflecting pool where Dr. King's body lay in state. And he had a little chapel there called the Chapel of All Faiths, just a little small building with 2 or 3 benches in it. You couldn't get 4 or 5 people in there, but it was quaint. And then they had the eternal flame, a flame that's lit, and his body lays there. And I would stay there all night with Dr. King. And I thought about the knock at midnight back then. But I had asked Coretta Scott King, just in a brief conversation. And I just let her know that how much I admired her and her work and the sacrifices her family made. And she asked me, she says, well, have you read Knock at Midnight? Of all the things she could have asked me, I thought that was interesting. And I never did get an opportunity to ask her why she asked me that, because I didn't know if she was referring to the sermon, Knock at Midnight, or his book, The Knock at Midnight. But I guess that's not relevant. What I want to say is, really, in a real sense, right now, we are at the knock at midnight. And so we can't allow Pharaoh, whatever these powers are that are keeping us divided. Again, another kingism, because he said that's one thing we've got to do. We've got to stick together. He went on to say that Pharaoh had a favorite formula for keeping people divided and keeping them in bondage and keeping them in slavery. And he said that was to keep them fighting amongst each other. And so we got Democrat, Republican, we got the Buddhist, we got the Hindu, we got the religious right and the religious left, the secular, non-secular. So many ways we're divided. You know, Pharaoh is very crafty. You know, just keep them fighting amongst each other. And as long as we're being manipulated like this, nobody's looking about who's doing the manipulating. So we've got to stop doing that. And he said that the key formula, the way to get around that is we just got to get together, just like the IPC. I'm so glad to be a part of that organization, the International Peace Coalition, because it's in coming together, as King said, that's the beginning of getting out of bondage. And he went on to talk about how during the civil rights movement, they marched for their rights, for the human rights, for human dignity. And they initiated the Montgomery boycotts with, you know, they would just refuse to ride the buses. But what they did was, for 381 days, they stuck together. And that's what we've got to do. We've got to stick together. And we realize, as Dennis was just talking about, you know, I wonder what type of an animal species it is that allows for the creation of weapons of mass destruction, the ability to destroy the planet multiple times over, as if one isn't enough, when we only have one planet. Where else are we going to go as a humanity? And if people really don't think that it's a real threat, that it really could happen, and I've got some friends that says, oh, there's no way that's going to happen, Darryl. Well, you know, Hiroshima and Nagasaki happened. I would say that the Auschwitz, the extermination of 6 million Jews and millions of other war dead really happened. It was too late for them. What we did to the Native Americans in this country happened. What happened to so many African Americans and other indigenous and minority people really happened. So I don't think that progress is going to roll in on the wheels of inevitability. And I would challenge anybody who would think anything different. And again, I even come from the clergy. You know, I'm a former pastor, minister. I was a jurisdictional bishop over 11 churches. But I would never be so naive as to tell somebody, well, God's going to come save us, because there's no place in history where there's any record of that. It's relied upon us to do the things necessary and cooperate and create the conditions for our own survival and for the well-being. And these are not the conditions I think that humanity was meant to exist in. So to Dennis's point, you know, I'm thinking about how to engage people. How do you have this conversation and illuminate people? Because I don't think that mankind is inherently bad. I don't think that our biggest problem is human badness, although we have plenty of examples of it. But Dr. King went on to say this. He says, you know, it's not human badness, but it's human blindness. He said, blindness is our condition and illumination is our greatest need. So the question becomes, how do we illuminate people? How do we take people and bring them to a conversation where the narrative has been so one-sided, where the media, who's owned for the most part by major corporations and Hollinger corporations, own 60% or more of all the media with corporate interest. And what we hear is what they want us to know. It's like Bob Marley's song, you know, they think that all that we know is what they tell us, you know. But we have to have these alternative ways to get the word out and to share with people and elevate them out of that ignorance. So my suggestion was, as a matter to do that, and this is my point, my conversation with Coretta Scott King, because she went on to tell the audience of people there that, you know, there were plenty of people before King that had tried in the struggle for human rights and dignity and civil rights. But he said the one thing that really made the distinction was we had the media when King came along. And so there was television. And it wasn't until people, they heard about things, they heard about lynchings and brutality and all the cruel things that were happening. But she went on to say that it really wasn't until people saw it with their own eyes, when they saw people getting blasted with water hoses, when they saw people being attacked by dogs, when they saw pictures of lynchings, then that's what it took to arouse the people's consciousness to say that, oh, we're not going to stand for that. So we have an advantage. We've got media now. So I think that we can leverage that. And if we could hold something like a People's Congress, I seriously doubt that our elected officials in government would have any interest in having an official meeting like this. I may be surprised. But if we were to hold one, there's some other groups that have a precedence for this, where they held these hearings and they were televised and they carried them on social media, on YouTube, and you can still see them to this day. And they've got millions and millions of views for some of the examples I'm seeing. But if we could do that, then we can have an honest, open discussion and we can tell the truth. We can have the truth tellers come and we can talk about the details that aren't being shared about the history of what's happening in the Middle East and how Israel was created. And how it's not really an issue of, well, it's beyond just Israel and Palestine and all they're fighting. But we got to talk about and maybe look at, how did that get created? Who created that condition? And was that condition necessary? You know, we can engage it at this level here, but maybe we need to go back to the causal basis and have an honest discussion so people can intellectually support and making a better decision rather than believing the narrative that's hiding some of the influences that are behind this. Maybe we can talk about Glass-Steagall. We can talk about Brenton Woods, but we need to provide an on-ramp where people can kind of get spoon-fed. In ministry, I used to say, break things down. I want to put it in your lap, so you get it. And I think that would be a great forum that we could put out there that people could engage. We can have multiple people. It could be a multiple day hearing, and we can bring all these different perspectives, and then people can come in and it's like a buffet, and they can come and get what they can. And if they get a little bit full, they can put it away and come back again later. We can have some dessert or come back tomorrow for lunch, but it will be there as a record, and they will have the truth tellers, not the political spin, not somebody else's flavor of the day, but we can be honest. We can be candid. And, like the scriptures would tell us, for lack of knowledge, our people perish. And then I'll throw one more kingism out there that I think is relevant, but I had mentioned this in our call last week, that one of our greatest challenges is it's what King called it's sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity. And he was talking in terms of just so many other issues beyond race. But that's one of our challenges, is we got so many people walking around, and you listen to the news and you believe and you think but the truth is you don't know. And you don't know that you don't know, but you're absolutely certain that you know. And that's the most dangerous condition for a person to believe in. It was a devout racist who was absolutely certain that white superiority was the truth, and knew it was absolutely sure that he was much better than anybody else. Hitler was absolutely certain that he was right in what he was doing, and everything that he did in Nazi Germany was legal. He thought he knew. He was absolutely certain that he knew, but he didn't know. He didn't know that he didn't know. But acting out of sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity, people get away with murder. So in closing, I just want to cite one more thing, and then we can have more open discussion. But again, thinking about the legacy of some of the people and the wisdom that's been left to us, I'd leave you probably one of King's quotes that I like even more than is "I have a dream" speech that I wish more people were aware of. And it wasn't even his words. But he asked us then, he said, was it not Albert Einstein who said that the world is in greater peril from those who do nothing, from those who actively commit evil? Or did not President Kennedy warn that those who do nothing are inviting both shame and violence? And Dr. King went on to say, will the nation ever forget the searing impact of Rabbi Joachim Prince's admonition as he spoke at the March on Washington in 1963? He said, when I was a rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime, I learned many things. But the most tragic thing that I learned in my life, and under tragic circumstances, is that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problems. The most urgent, the most shameful, and the most tragic problem is silence. A great people who had created a great civilization had become a nation of silent onlookers. They remained silent in the face of hate, in the face of brutality, in the face of mass murder. Sound familiar? He said, America must not remain silent. America must not become a nation of onlookers. It must speak up and act, from the president down to the humblest of us, and not for the sake of the Negro, but for the sake of the image, the idea, and the aspirations of America itself. So my challenge for all of us, my aspiration is to wake people up, to wake up, brother, because we are in the midst of a revolution and we cannot remain silent.
I think you muted.
Oh, muted. There we go. There we go. Thank you so much. So, Jose, do you have some thoughts?
I have no idea how to follow up either Dennis or Darryl, but it has provoked a lot of thought in me, particularly Diane, your also point in the beginning. You were talking about, you showed this grand picture of the Earth in relation to space. And this thought occurred to me: if people are fighting over location, I mean, we have an infinite amount of space. I mean, why don't we just give one group of people the moon so they'll figure out how to colonize it and develop it, or Mars, right? And I was also thinking about the House of Atreus that Dennis has been referencing a lot this week, because in particular, Zeus, who likes to mess with natural law, he comes in and he, makes the sun rise from the west and set in the east this time because he wants one person to be a king. I think about the parallel to today, how there are people who think they are like Zeus, who can decide to mess with natural law by just killing people or murdering people, and trying to stop the natural aversion that people have of killing and murdering and driving people that way. Because Darryl, you said it right, that what were the conditions that actually created this problem? What are the conditions that drive people to kill people, right? And it's always the oligarchs. It's always people who think they are above us who create these conditions that force people to remove that natural aversion to kill, to say, you know what, I have to now disrupt natural law in order to achieve whatever objective I want. And so really it's never really just as complicated as this, or as simple as this person did this to me a while ago, so now I'm going to strike back at them by doing this and that. It seems that way, but when you look at it, it's actually the people who just talk, the old people, the old politicians who just talk, and then it's just young people who end up dying for it, right? So
Yeah.
in thinking about the theme, about the forgotten men and women who can actually do something, I guess I'll just give a report on some of the activities that have happened this week. And Diane can also speak to this too, because she was at an RFK rally on Monday, on Columbus Day, or Indigenous Peoples Day, Columbus Day. And RFK Jr. announces independence from the Democratic Party. So you have candidates now that are leaving dying parties like the Democratic Party and are declaring their independence. And I'm sure Diane organized lots of people down there. And then we went to Washington, D.C., about 14 of us stood outside the Longworth building at the Capitol. And we held up a big banner that was 3 feet by 8 feet that said, LaRouche to Congress, no more money for Ukraine, no World War III with Russia. And then we sang Dona Nobis. We spoke on the bullhorn, talking about the importance of why we need to end these wars, why the United States needs to be a force for peace, and not this Zeusian-like figure of just causing different conditions to create problems and tension all around the world. And we met with several high-level contacts and high-level people in the Capitol, and we spoke to these people who may have heard of our name before. Some people recognized the Schiller Institute, because that's what we went in as, the delegation of the Schiller Institute. And we gave drop-offs of our pamphlets and leaflets, most notably Helga Zepp-LaRouche's 10 Principles, and also a leaflet that we wrote up, why there needs to be no more funding towards Ukraine and Israel. And so I would just emphasize to people who are listening today that all action has effect, and all action generates motion. Even if it's something tiny, like just calling your congressman or writing an email, it does have an effect. It has an unseen effect that you can't necessarily quantify. And we see that with what's going on right now. I'm getting reports of other people who are sitting in their congressman's office, people who are going to their congressman's office with signs. And for example, right now, there is a group of people getting arrested because they sat in Elizabeth Warren's office in Boston, and they refused to leave until she would denounce the United States' role in stoking tensions in the Israel-Palestine conflict. So now they're all getting arrested, but we're getting word of that. And that goes to Darryl's point of when people see these images of people actually fighting for a just cause, fighting for peace, fighting for their rights, people will act and be courageous. And I think it all helps. It all reverberates, and we just need more of it. You have to put the pedal to the metal. People should go to their congressman's office with signs. People should just call, knock, whatever you have, whoever. And there is reason to go to your city council, because a nuclear bomb affects us all. I've had people ask me, well, but sometimes my congressman can't be reached. It's okay. Go to your city council. You can interrupt the city council meeting and say, hey, I'm afraid of a nuclear bomb and my basement doesn't have a fallout shelter. So what am I supposed to do? This is an everyone problem. This is a New York City mayor problem, just like as much as it might be a Portland, Oregon mayor problem, just like it's your congressman's problem, just like it's your president's problem, but ultimately it's your problem. You can't run away from this at this point. And there is no safe side anymore. You now have to actually have the moral courage to stand up and say, you know what, my country has been a force for violence, and it's time to restore natural law and make it a force for peace. So do something. And if you don't know what to do, but you want to do something, contact us and we will figure out what you can do. I think if we're throwing out kingisms, there was one that really inspired me where he said, if you're a street sweeper, then sweep the streets like Beethoven composed. If you can't fly, then you got to run. And if you can't run, then walk. And if you can't walk, then crawl. And if you can't crawl, you better do something. So
Just be there.
That's right. So I'll end it there.
Great, thanks. And you'll bring us all here together so we can see each other. While you're bringing us on, there's a couple of things I want to say. One is, as a candidate running for office, there's actually nothing I hate more than people saying, where do you stand on X? Because my sense is that people use this as an excuse. They have a series. Where do you stand on apple pie with cheese or without cheese? Do you support pink pussycats? Should we have fried or scrambled eggs? Should we have roast beef well done or medium rare? And there's a series of issues, single issues that people consider very important if they get a long enough list. And everyone knows the really hot button ones: Second Amendment, abortion, very emotional. It's not to say that there's not really, we're about to have a nuclear war, guys, and our economy is disintegrating. And I think that the list is for the purpose of the voter to say, you got that one wrong. Apple pie with cheese, no way. Therefore, there's no one I can trust, and I'm going to go back to doing nothing. As opposed to taking responsibility for making the change, causing the person that is attempting to lead or willing to take responsibility to change, or to educate that person, or to demand the policy that is needed. One is a very passive, sadistic approach, and I see some comments in the chat. So where does so-and-so stand on blah? No, the question is, where do you stand? Where will you stand? And will you make sure that what happens needs to happen? The second point is that, and Darryl, and now I feel like I should call you Reverend from what you said, because your remarks were very that way, reminds me of some minister friends of mine. But you started talking about Glass-Steagall. In other words, we actually have to have the concrete proposals. We can say peace, but there is no such thing as peace unless there is a shared mission. And when Rabin and Arafat signed the Oslo Accords, Lyndon LaRouche said there were a whole series of water management and economic development projects associated with this, so that there would be an actual physical benefit to the agreement. And Mr. LaRouche warned, if the International Monetary Fund, if the banks are put in charge of this and we don't get those shovels in the ground immediately, that this will drown in blood. And so I'm thinking of the conditions in which people are living all over the world, the amount of poverty, the amount of hardship, the amount of anxiety, because with the absence of war, or the absence of war will be brought about because we set our sights on a different mission, which is the uplifting of mankind with very specific policy initiatives. So those are my two thoughts.
Well, Diane, thank you for your accolades earlier, and as well as your comment. And it brings to mind, there's a couple of things that really get in my core as I listen to what you're saying. And again, I'm thinking about the challenge of reaching people. Even with Jose, if you can't be this and be a tree, be a shrub. If you can't be but at the end of the day, we all have an individual responsibility, and it's igniting that sense of who I am, and for people to give themselves permission to step out of these small roles that we play. And even to Jose's point, if you can go back, and if you were one of those astronauts who was sitting in a capsule looking back at a small little blue marble, and you marvel at the expanse of space, and you think that we are fighting over that. And then while you're out there in space, why not get in touch with your cosmic identity, that spiritual aspect, that non-physical mind that we have, and start asking yourselves, who told you that your voice doesn't matter? Who is one man to tell me that I'm less, I'm reminded of Bob Marley. He says, when I check it all out, every man was once a baby, just like me. So why did they want to be ruler over the people? I can't dig it, man, in Bob Marley's vernacular. But how do we get to the place where people can step out of that and let people govern and rule? And it's particularly, if nothing can get you in touch with your humanity. I've got grandchildren. I want them to have a future. And when I look at images of little girls, little babies recently, their lives snuffed out or their faces mangled. And if it doesn't move you, if it doesn't move people, then I'm saying, what kind of a human being are you? I have a good friend who's a Dogon who was initiated into the Dogon priesthood, these were the priests of the pharaohs during the pharaonic periods. And they would say that, the number one reason for a human being to be here is for our spiritual evolution. And they would go on to say that we are only human beings through our interaction with other human beings. That's what makes us human. That's what the whole drill is all about. And we graduate to the extent that we recognize that connection. As King would say, quoting another author, but, no man is an island unto himself. Each man is a continent, a part of the main, such that what affects one man affects me. So the death of any man diminishes me because I am involved with mankind. And that's what we should be. I had said earlier that I love my Ukrainian brother as much as I love my Russian brother. We're family. I love my Palestinian, my Gaza brother as much as I love my Israeli brother. We are family. And when my kids are fighting, I don't allow one of my sons to go exterminate his other brothers and their family. When you're a parent, you sit down and you fix it, you address it, and you find nonviolent direct actions to do it. But you don't kill your kids. You teach them. And so we've got some illegitimate parents trying to run things around here. I say we all put ourselves up for adoption. We fire our illegitimate parents and kick them out of the house, because they're not doing their children right. King used to say that God sent me by here to tell you that he wants you to straighten up and start treating his children right. And, he says it's so good to sing about glory over yonder, my robe over yonder. But he said that every once in a while, God's children want a new pair of shoes and a nice dress down here. So to my religious friends that says waiting for God to come and fix it, I'm saying, no. Get down here and cooperate, and let's make these conditions better for the people that are coming in behind us. And don't be so selfish and self-centered, because it's not about you. It's all about us. My Mayan friends would tell us that the doorway to the future is only big enough for one person, speaking to the unity of humanity. So we have to come into one accord. If we're going to have a future, we have to come to one accord and one voice to some extent if we're going to get out of these yokes of oppression that are not even just us, although I may feel free, but I can recognize the oppression of the people in Gaza and in Palestine. And I listened to how even some of the spokespeople for some of the other parties tried to twist what's going on over there, but to be living in an apartheid state and policed and kind of pressed into a ghetto, and they say it's one of the most densely populated places in the world, and they're living under it's colonization at its worst, and we can't be okay with that. We wouldn't allow it for ourselves. We wouldn't want it for our children, and we shouldn't want it for them. But it's when we allow, just like what Einstein was talking about, all is necessary for evil to flourish is for the good people of the world to do nothing. We have to be concerned about one another. And so that's what I really, really like about the presentation, the organization for the LaRouche Institute, and what Lyndon did when I saw this is 25 years ago, the Silk Road. And the most phenomenal thing that I remember when I first heard about this in the 90s, when he said that if we construct this infrastructure that creates jobs and opportunities and lifts people out of poverty, like the high-speed rail train built upon the model of the old Silk Road of the old world. But what I was amazed about it, what he said, it would cost less than nothing to do it. And I'm thinking, how can you have a project that big and it costs less than nothing? But again, you talk about how it creates jobs along the way. And so why would my neighbor have a beef with me when now we're depending on each other for labor and for transporting goods and services? We're not competing against each other. We're cooperating with each other. And that's the beauty of what BRICS, I think, is all about. That my European brothers and sisters are not getting the truth of. So many people that I talk to have no idea when I mention BRICS. When I mention there's 219 countries on the planet, and 161 of them seem to be inclined to go along with that program. And then to the point of Diane's map, when you start to look at the geography of what's happening, where conflicts are emerging, it's probably more than a simple coincidence that we're seeing conflict in those areas that are protecting the European colonial capitalistic interests. So people have got to start asking themselves intelligent questions. Like I said, sincere ignorance. And I don't mean it as a slander, because if you know, all people know, speaking of listeners, if all you know is what you believe is what the media is telling you, then we're back in this paradigm that, if you watch the news, you're misinformed. If you don't watch the news, you're uninformed. But through forums like this, we can have that dialogue, and none of us is smarter than all of us, but we need to bring our collective minds together. And I think that's going to be the tide that raises all ships. And I'll hush up there.
Okay, good. I think Dennis has something and has to go. And actually, it's we're going slightly over time, but we can go a few more minutes. Dennis, please.
Well, the following, if you can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Just on this issue of why something like the Silk Road costs nothing, or why, for example, the space program costs nothing. The reason for that is that we're not just talking about a series of roads. We're not just talking about a series of jobs. It's that if you have a product that begins as a semi-finished good, and you want to ship this to another location, let's say across the United States, that the idea of the development corridor is that you have cities and production centers on either side of that corridor, which can be a rail station, it can be high-speed rail, and you have skilled labor that by working is able to take something that begins in one state and ends in a completely finished product. So, for example, it's, if you ask yourself the question, if you have a ship and you put a bunch of containers on the ship, you ship those containers across, let's say, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The containers don't gain value as you ship them. But if you do it by means of a development corridor, the products themselves are improved and transformed as they are shipped. So the whole idea is that you actually are building something that is not only doesn't cost you nothing, it actually is an investment, and it's producing value that you can't get otherwise. So you're actually, it's as though you were growing resources. So the way that people think about extracting coal, suppose you thought about the idea of multiplying coal or multiplying oil. That's what you actually are doing with the development corridor. And so, by the way, just to say, best place that you could do that is exactly where all this fighting is going on, because it's a crossroads between Africa, Europe, and Asia. And that's one of the reasons that resolving this is not even really a question of land. It can be the way that people have talked about it, but it wouldn't have to be, because you could take the most advanced technologies. Certainly Israel has a lot of it. And this was part of LaRouche's original Oasis plan in 1975 when he proposed it. His idea was that the countries of Iraq, Iran, and other countries of that area would take the oil and other resources, and in exchange for them, they would have nuclear technology. And that nuclear technology was first generation, going to a wholly different level in which you were going to go to controlled thermonuclear fusion. What people keep saying is 40 years away, but it's only 40 years away because it was never invested in. And so the idea is that that area of Southwest Asia could be the most productive and most crucial, one of the most crucial linchpins for all of humanity. And Palestine, ironically, can be the very center of that. So the conception should be to invert the way that everybody is thinking about this, that almost everything that people are saying are the primary considerations are the opposite. For example, water is the most important thing there. The second thing is it's a crossroads for education. If you have the three religions there already, obviously you could make this a major center of education as a whole, in terms of language studies, for example, philology, talking about the ancient languages and bringing particularly the Greeks in there as well. There's all sorts of things. You could do what was done in 10th century Spain and Andalusia, where you had a dialogue of that type between Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. You could do it right there. These things are going to have to be brought up, though, by people who are not Tony Blinken. They don't have that cultural problem. They don't have that cultural level. Well, we won't say more about him. But I just wanted to say that because we have a great opportunity in this crisis. And that's also true also in the Ukraine situation. These are not, Diane already said it before, there is no Middle East crisis the way it's being described. That was what LaRouche had said when he was at that Central Connecticut University. It's a different conception altogether. And by taking the idea out that there is a Middle East crisis, changing that axiom, then what we can do is launch the world on a whole series of cooperative developments that are very important. China is talking to the Palestinian Authority already along these lines, but we need to make sure the United States and the transatlantic nations are also involved. That's our job, though. As you said, you've got to fire the illegitimate parents to get that done.
Diane?
Yeah, go ahead, Jose.
I just wanted to respond to Darryl, who said, what were those astronauts thinking as they saw the blue marble? And I can tell you, because the astronauts of Apollo 8 on Christmas, I think it was Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, what they did was, as they were orbiting the moon, they read the book of Genesis, at least the first 10 verses. And the three astronauts each read an even amount of verses, or except Frank Borman, who only reads the last two. And he ends off, after he reads it, he starts by saying, "We are now approaching lunar sunrise, and for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you." So you think about it, because there were 1 billion people watching this live, I think, at least. Yeah, around the world, television sets glowed with the broadcast. 1 in 4 people on Earth, roughly 1 billion people spread among 64 countries, listened to the reading. And within 24 hours, recorded broadcasts of the address from the moon reached people in another 30 countries. Audiences in North and South America, as well as Europe, tuned in live thanks to the recently launched Intelsat 3 satellite. And so, they say, we are now approaching lunar sunrise, and for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. And so then they read the first 10 verses of Genesis among the three of the astronauts. And then they end it by saying, and from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth. And I bring that up because it's, Dennis was talking about this Kuza idea of, well, you can't really put religion on one place or one geography. How does the meaning of Genesis change when it's talking about the earth when you're reading it on the orbit of the moon? And not just to mention the fact that this is being broadcasted to everyone on earth from the moon. Does that change how does that elevate the meaning, or how does it transform the meaning? I don't know, but I just wanted to respond to what you were saying, Darryl.
I appreciate that. And the fact that you went on to specify that it was over a lunar, was it lunar sunrise?
The sunrise, yeah.
Or lunar moonrise. I'm sorry. But it does. I'm thinking about illumination. And I think it's magnificent that even astronauts in a moment like that would at least acknowledge a scriptural reference that starts with in the beginning. And so I think it would make them stop and just ponder. I imagine I'd be thinking, what was this whole thing all about? Looking at that beautiful thing and what we can do with it, and our potential or our purpose on it. And I think to some extent we've allowed ourselves to kind of get hijacked into becoming things, just like labels like Hamas or labels like terrorists. When you can thingify a person, then it makes it possible to be inhumane. And that's what I think what the media does successfully, unfortunately, is they create a label, and next thing you know, we're killing rebels or we're killing terrorists, but we're not killing human beings. But like King said, murder was wrong. It was wrong in 1823, it was wrong in 1963, and it's wrong in 2023. Always has been wrong and always will be wrong. But we live with this relativistic knock at midnight ethic where we've kind of reduced truth to being relative. And absolute truth is kind of out the window anymore, or even in the courts of America. You may ask for the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, but you get no three, you don't get any of them. But we've got to be the truth tellers, and that's why I appreciate this forum, and I appreciate Diane and Dennis and yourself, Jose, for giving me an opportunity to share, because at the end of the day, it's all about the truth, and it's so elusive. But I do believe that, that the truth will make us free, and it'll get people out of this captivity of the illusion that has been hoodwinked or foisted upon us, and still has been. I share another Kingism when I would say that I too have an audacious faith in the future of humanity. I have an audacious faith that we will persevere, that we will win. But again, I'd say it's not going to roll in on the wheels of inevitability. It's going to take some more determination. It's going to take some hard work. It's going to take some of that strength to love that Dennis was talking about and the King wrote about, to where I love this humanity. I love people enough that I'm even willing to chastise people. I love people enough to let them know, hey, you're going the wrong way. I love you enough that I'm not going to let you squander in your error. And I hope to have the dogged determination, tenacity like Diane does, that you can even stand up when it's not very popular, to take that popular stand. Even when it wasn't very popular to speak out on the war in Vietnam, but he did it. He was ostracized for it, but he did it, and he was right. Truth forever on the scalpel, wrong forever on the throne. But that scalpel sways the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. Thank you.
Thank you. So with that, I think we should wrap up. And I would like to say in closing that year, 1968, saw on April 4th the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., and on June 6th, the assassination of Robert Kennedy. And on Christmas Eve, that beautiful message from the astronauts as they looked back on Earth from outer space and were reminded of the beauty of God's creation, which they were responsible for in part, as we are humans. So I think that was quite a year. And if people could emerge from that darkness, we can too. But I agree, not easily, and it depends on every one of us. So thanks for joining me. And I hope that we will all see each other again very soon. The alternative is not acceptable.